can tell by now I'm the kind of guy you like. I'll take you for the ride of your lonely life. You can tell by now, baby, you can tell by now. You can cry all night, but I'm never coming home. You've got to understand that I need to roam. You can tell by now, baby, you can tell by now.
Growing up, my brother and I were occasionally asked if we were related to Elmer Taflinger. We knew he was an artist who was somehow related to Grandpa and had died when we were young, but nothing else. A few years ago, we discovered he'd written an unpublished autobiography called Revolting Hoosier. Grandpa had a few hundred pages of it, but I couldn't make sense of what I saw. I didn't think about it again until I was trying to come up with a name for my video productions. Revolting Hoosier seemed like a good name for me and my brother to reclaim, something uniquely Taflinger that reflected our Indiana upbringing and revolutionary or appalling ideas. But we still didn't know anything about Elmer himself, so I set out to discover the man behind our chosen name. Elmer Edward Taflinger was born in Indianapolis, Indiana on March 3, 1891. His grandparents were my grandfather's grandparents, making them cousins, 30 years apart. He had a younger sister, Coral, who became a history teacher and married a biology teacher. He lived in their house for several decades until he died. He studied under Otto Stark at Manual High School. Stark was a member of the Hoosier Group, a nationally known group of 5 Indiana landscape artists, including T.C. Steele and William Forsythe.
Most of the good artists came from Manual. Otto Stark was the art department head, so he would have learned from the very, very best, because Stark was an ultimate teacher, as well as a consummate artist, and he believed in finding, seeking out talented young students and then encouraging them to go on to art school.
He insisted that Elmer leave Indiana to continue his art training, so after saving money working as a stagehand in Indianapolis, he left for New York City and the Art Students League. After a few years, Elmer began working full-time for noted Broadway producer David Belasco, where he remained for 8 years as art director. Belasco sent him to Europe several times to research costumes and buy materials.
It was the leading Broadway producer in the 20s in New York, and he agreed to hire him as a costume designer. And when Belasco put on a play, it called for a costume for a certain period for an individual, whether it's a queen or a prince or whatever. He wanted it authentic. And since Elmer had no contact with what he needed to have contact with, he went to Italy and to France, both, to study costumes there and make drawings to bring back to Belasco.
Yeah, we got him talking about that because he would have all of these wonderful materials for the setups for the models. And he said when he worked on Broadway, you had to use the best material there is because they were wearing these costumes every night. They had to move up.
It was a Yankee Doodle Dandy with James Cagney. And we're sitting there and everybody's just hardly watching it. And he said, all of a sudden he said, "Wow, that son of a bitch, I used to have coffee with him every morning at such and such in New York." And all of it, everybody goes, "Huh?" Come again. And he knew everyone in films, movie stars, because they would be in New York with the theater, and he knew them. And he said, "Oh, the actors are a bunch of kids. They're childish. I can't stand them. It's all the directors is where it's at, and the artistic production that makes it, and they're just a bunch of idiots."
When his girlfriend pressured him to focus more on his art, Elmer left Belasco and returned to the Art Students League, where he won spots in the day and night classes in human figure drawing taught by draftsman George Bridgman.
My brain had grown up through the years. My taste, as I had seen the best that the world could offer, had become better.
His biggest art influence, Bridgman was an old anatomy shark, according to Elmer. He studied with him for a few years, almost always staying among the top 4 in the classes. When he was nearing the end of his studies, Bridgman said, "I'm nearing the end of my life and all I know is naked women." Elmer contrasted his influences in his memoirs.
Belasco, whom naked women knew, and Bridgman, who knew naked women.
But he was a great draftsman, and I think that's where Elmer learned to draw. And you can see, no one can really draw like that anymore. They just don't take the time to learn to draw.
Elmer left New York for good after a breakup with the love of his life, Jessica Daub, a hat maker. They had fought off and on for years, but when he discovered she was seeing another man, he left to Europe for several weeks to let her think about it.
This martyr stuff was feeling pretty tasty by now. I had a halo around my head. All great men had to suffer. I was suffering. As a consequence, I would be great. New York that I once loved is now inanimate.
When she still hadn't decided, he left for a job teaching at the Minneapolis School of Art. Probably as a result of his European travels, Elmer came down with diphtheria while visiting Indianapolis before starting his job. Nervous system problems plagued him during his year in Minneapolis, so that he could hardly walk or hold charcoal to draw. After returning from Minneapolis, Elmer lived in Florence, Italy for a few years, studying the great artists and perfecting his skills. When he moved back to Indianapolis, he began teaching figure drawing and portrait painting. In 1935, he moved into the Elmer E. Taflinger studio on East 14th Street and taught for almost 40 years. His students seemed to universally love him.
Taft was single, as you know, never married, and he was a true artist. He devoted his entire life to art. If he wasn't painting or sketching or drawing, he was teaching.
I do remember talking to a couple of his students once, and they were just passionate about him. They just thought he was the best teacher.
And he'd have classes of 30 students, and there would be a range, beginners to advanced, and he treated everyone the same. I think anyone that studied with him loved him, because some people, you thought, well, they'll never, why are they here? But he treated them like they had great potential.
He said, I see it as my job to discourage more people with no talent, to give it up.
He was a little jealous of some of us that, like when I first went to Europe with Herb Olson to paint, he couldn't hardly stand it.
His classes were very, very popular, and everybody loved him. Even though he was very, very critical and very outspoken, you accepted it because at the end of it, you'd probably laugh at what he said. It wasn't meant out in the general way of criticizing an art student, but he had a knack about not upsetting you.
Highly recommended for his ability in portrait and figure work. Like we would always draw in the morning and then follow him around from one person's work to another around the room in the afternoon, so we would all benefit from the criticism that was given to each person there. Everybody I've been to since then has remarked about my foundation in what I'm doing. You have a good foundation is what they would say to me, and I owe it all to Elmer.
Yeah, it was a great basis for any other art. Of course, his philosophy was that if you can draw the human figure, you can draw anything. And it was a wonderful groundwork. And he made you draw until he thought you were ready to paint. But it was strictly life drawing and nudes. We had one pose for the whole week, which was a long time. Yes,
So,
you had to learn the bones and the muscles, and you had to be able to name them and the whole work. So it was a good groundwork. That was the one thing that was wrong with his classes. He didn't have enough short poses and things. But we certainly learned how to draw the human figure. We were very nice back then, and the men wore little jock straps. I would have been shocked, but I was shocked seeing the women too, but he'd come up with all these little tricks for us to learn something.
Like,
They always meant something. Whatever his poses were, we had to learn something from. Although we had all kinds of models. Some of them were very interesting.
Oh, you'd have clowns, you'd have circus people. I know he said to me one time, well, Sally, you might be a good artist if you weren't married.
You would be a pretty good artist if you weren't a teacher. But I understand why he said that to me, why you can't, because it's time. It's your time. And if you're going to be passionate about art, you have to lose a little passion about teaching. And if you're going to be passionate about teaching, it takes a little bit of away. Because you just can't be a superhuman person.
Your father probably had dreams of his own, but with all those children, how could he possibly pursue them? He said he never would have been as productive artistically if he lived a normal life like my dad and had a normal job and 5 kids. He wouldn't have been as productive. because he put all of his emotions into his painting and his art students.
I'd say even though he lived in his brother-in-law's house, he's hardly ever home. He had a bed at the studio if he didn't want to go home.
He had a bed and a stove.
Yeah, and he had all his friends' cups hanging on the wall with their names on them, you know, and so it was kind of a gathering place for his friends, acquaintances.
The floor was just filthy because he taught art here, and it was just paint splattered all over the floor. He was an artist, you know, he lived, he breathed, he died art. And as far as dirt, dust, who cared?
So I made a point to go to his studio and meet him. And I took the kids down there one Sunday. They went to Heron Art Institute and to see a movie. And Mary Ann went with me to the studio. When we left, I said to Mary Ann, well, what did you think of the place? She said, well, I saw one picture in there. I think it ought to be covered up. That's what she told me.
Several students still have portraits he made of them, which they won by various means.
And the way I got my portrait was that he had a party. He was always having parties, watermelon parties, anything for an excuse. And he had hidden straight pins all over his studio. He had the balcony up above, had little straight pins everywhere. And so the person that found the most straight pins, he would do a drawing for them. And so it turned out that one other person, a young man, and myself started getting the most pins, finding the most. Well, then our friends started giving us their pins, and it turned out at the end of the time that I had the most pins. So Taflinger said, well, he said, you want to pose for this picture? And I said, not in the nude. And he said, well, why not? And I said, no, not me. I want something I can put in my living room someday. Then he entered it in the Hoosier Salon, and he got Best of Show. So it is a beautiful pastel. It truly is. And I've just treasured it forever.
In fact, that portrait that he did of me, I won bobbing for apples at a party. It didn't bother me to get my hair wet, so I went all the way to the bottom. He did 3 portraits of those, so I still have that.
Although it's not something you would think of by looking at his work, Elmer was a rebel in that he was a traditionalist in modern times and thought that art should uplift humankind, like Renaissance art. Elmer thought it important to teach the fundamentals and was a vocal critic of the Heron Art School. At one time, he claimed to have taught more students than Heron.
He did tell me that it was a shame that I went to Heron because they weren't teaching much there. When I graduated from Heron, it was that era of, throwing paint and closing your eyes and painting with your left hand if you were right-handed, and just throwing all structure to the wind. It was that be free and just be expressive expressionism and not realism.
I can see what he would have thought. He thought this is a whole new gang and guys that are coming in and going to change the whole story about education of an artist.
The upper class students gravitated towards was complete total abstraction, and they didn't want anything to do with realism. And I think that Taflinger felt that was like a cop-out. That is probably why he was very vocally outspoken against Heron.
His opinion of modern art was there was no art to it. There was no perspective to it. There was no statement about mankind. There was no redeeming feature in it. So in his mind, painting sort of peaked at the Renaissance and have been downhill ever since.
See, the sad thing about Taflinger was he had a great start and a promising start, but then things changed because it all of a sudden went not figural anymore. It was all abstract. And so as a teacher, he was fine because you needed to be grounded in that. But as far as fine art was going, this stuff was old news and old hat, and it had been done for so long that it was just like, ugh. I mean, that's why I don't think he ever became famous, shall we say.
Although it's not something you would think of by looking at his work, Elmer was a rebel in that he was a traditionalist in modern times and thought that art should uplift humankind, like Renaissance art.
I was artistic, and artists were not supposed to conform according to those lousy, stinking teachers who talked about art with a capital A, who didn't know a damn thing about drawing, didn't have guts enough to learn to draw, or they never would have been teachers in a system as rotten as the one that infests the whole of America.
While he taught, Elmer also worked on side projects and portrait commissions. One of his most famous works is The Apotheosis of Science, a 21-foot by 5.5-foot mural commissioned by his brother-in-law Robert Black in the 1930s. The center panel portrays 4 Greek scientists, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Archimedes, and Euclid, and shows the classification of plants and animals around a central, Da Vinci-esque male figure. The side panels feature 45 of the greatest scientists representing fields from astronomy to zoology. It is now on display behind glass in the library of Manual High School. In 1937, Elmer also painted a fresco as a wedding present to his sister and brother-in-law in the house where they all lived. Using lime from Diego Rivera's aborted mural at the Rockefeller Center, Elmer created The Triumph of the Ideal, which some say is about mankind and others say is about him personally. His sister said that it was based on the revelation of John in the New Testament. It begins in the backyard with a sculpture by one of his students, representing man coming out of the earth. The wall inside starts in the corner with a couple and a baby, then a female child, then a male adolescent. That side also shows 3 handicapped men. The 3 fates come next, riding behind the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the 4 riders representing painting, music, drama, and writing. The ideal figure and the dove of peace tower above them all, above people representing flaws such as jealousy, cheating, and vanity. The tired artist, Elmer's self-portrait, sits in the center of everything, facing away from the ideal. There are 44 people and 11 animals, and it took him 77 days to paint after the initial sketches. Another famous mural was titled The Immortal Seesaw and made for Bal Moderne, a Beaux-Arts ball for the Indiana Artists Club in 1957. 78 feet wide by 21 feet high, it was painted on brown paper and rolled up. Elmer depicted the struggle between classic and modern art. Being on the side of classicism, Elmer portrayed modern artists as circus-like, hanging off of and dwarfed by giant statues of Venus de Milo and Michelangelo's David. Picasso has cubed shoes, Van Gogh offers sunflowers to Venus, Dali swings upside down from a trapeze, and Chagall and Toulouse-Lautrec duel with color.
The murals he made for the Beaux Art Ball, yes, and we watched the progress of that, and they were significant, very significant works.
Taft didn't think much of the Impressionists.
And it was the old masters and the modern art together, fighting each other all over the place. And he rolled up on a thing, and we were supposed to do it for him. He was just supposed to start it out, and then he didn't trust any of us to do it, so he ended up doing it, and he also ended up with an ulcer, because he would stay at the studio almost all night. I guess after the classes, he would stay there.
Another huge project that Elmer worked on, off and on for 20 years, was the ruins at Holiday Park.
Western decided that when they tear down the St. Paul building, over the entrance were the statues of man representing 3 races. And they decided maybe a good way to dispose of it was to allow cities in which there was a Western Electric facility, plant, to present plans for how they would use these statues. The plan that's submitted by Elmer was approved, and they tore down the building, and Western shipped it here to Indianapolis, and they hauled it out to the Holiday Park. Elmer, of course, because he made the drawing, was interested in pursuing the plans for how it would be used. And he began with the outline, and either the Parks Department didn't like it, and they began to suggest this and that should be done. And Elmer didn't take suggestions very easily, so he walked away. And all of this material lay there for 20 years. And when Hutnut became mayor, he went to see Elmer and tried to persuade him, would you pursue your plans that got the statues to Indianapolis. And he said if he had complete control, the last say, and nobody bothered him. So he laid out the plan and completed it as he wanted it.
He said, let them have it. All I want is that the art be preserved. And it doesn't have to be about me. They can take all the credit, they can get all the publicity and all the splash, I don't care, but I want the art to be the way it should be. He wanted that sculpture preserved because it was all about how there's no difference between the races. And so it's a very humanistic statement.
People were really upset and thought it was a monstrosity.
Besides the columns and statues, which make up the main part, there are 26 smaller columns in the back, which used to form the inner part of a reflecting pool. There are trees planted representing the 50 states, an additional 13 representing the colonies, around an area called Constitution Mall. Standing opposite the statues across the mall stand 3 large stones to show that the 3 races rose from crude stone. 3 stones sit outside the fence, representing the 3 branches of government.
Yeah, it's like a beautiful sanctuary holiday park. We used to take our children there and just look at those big figures, and it was really neat to have that in Indianapolis.
In 1963, Elmer moved to Cuernavaca, Mexico to be with Jessica again. He was there off and on for 6 years, building a house with her. Right before they were to be married, she died, and he returned to Indianapolis.
He had such a romance that went on so many years, and it's not like today, and not physical like today. He was thrilled when she touched him or kissed him on the cheek.
And she would not agree to marry him because he was a little bit taken by the bottle at that time. But they kept in contact. And he asked her to go with him to Mexico. And they'd build a studio there, and he'd paint, and she could do her designs or whatever, and that they were to get married.
When he announced that he was going to call Jessica in Mexico, his love of his life. And we all encouraged him to call her. Well, he was so excited on Monday, he said that when he called her, she said, come on down. And so then he called me at home. I lived in Noblesville. He called me and says, I've got to go shopping. He said, I've got to go have formal clothes, you know, and she was a jet setter, you know. He said, I've got to go. He says, you and June will just have to go shopping with me. So he got a whole wardrobe to go down there. But I guess none of it passed muster. She wanted Italian-made clothes or something.
And he had pictures of her, and she was a very attractive older lady, and very fancy dress. He liked that. He liked women who dressed up, looked very feminine, and she did.
When you go to Mexico, you're under Napoleonic code of law. When he did try to come back, he could not bring his automobile back. He could not derive anything from what his investment was. She died, which created the problem for him.
And I could almost see it the way he told it, with the sunshine and all of that. It was a fresh morning.
She had a stroke and fell over, and they thought it was a very suspicious, it does sound suspicious, doesn't it? A very suspicious accident, so they threw him in jail for murder.
I assumed that, you know, his dream to be married and to set up a studio there was, of course, dashed. And he didn't see any need to stay in Mexico any longer.
And so he was very, very sad for several years because he was really, so excited about it.
So we had Elmer's artistic history, but what was he really like as a person? What did other people think of him? What did he do after he stopped teaching? It seems like he was quite a character and often made the news with his complaints and criticisms. When a New York artist was commissioned to represent Indiana at the Chicago World's Fair, Elmer, saying he wanted to be relieved of the stigma of Indiana artist, petitioned to have his birthplace legally changed to someplace more conducive to artistic recognition by Indiana officials.
If someone in the city did something that he didn't agree with, he'd voice his opinion.
You know, he was different from anyone I'd ever known. But I expected him to be different. He had a reputation that preceded him before I got there, you know.
No, I don't know if you say eccentric. Can you say that about artists? But he was a little different. He followed a different drummer sometimes.
I learned a lot of things from Elmer. He had some interesting ideas, to say the least.
But he had a different mindset. He was a party man. He was a jolly fellow. You know. But he had a lot of fight to him. He could be very sharp, but he didn't want you to be sharp to him. He wanted you to be kind to him.
I didn't want to know him. I'd heard that he was so cantankerous, and he didn't get along with the instructors at the art school very well. I ran over to see the fire, and the firemen were running in with their hoses. And Elmer came up and stood beside me and said something so vulgar about the firemen, as you may imagine, with their hoses. And that I broke up laughing, and he said, he had a very high voice. Well, do you have this frame shop? You do this studio right here? And I said, yes, that's me. He said, well, I think I'll come over, go follow you in and see what you do. And he continued to come for the next 5 years or more. But he was kind of a cross between a father, older brother, and buddy. Elmer could hit it off with somebody of all ages, maybe some kid, 18 to any age. And he would tell stories in New York to make New York come alive. Snowstorms and walking to some coffee shop and meeting who's who of movie stars to theatrical stars, and a lot of fun to listen to his stories. He was captivating. Well, I remember taking the Orient Express to Istanbul, and he always had a story, and all of a sudden you're off on another adventure.
He got cantankerous in the end. Well, I loved him in spite of his faults. I mean, that's the only Christian way to do it.
You could pick him out in a crowd. Beware, there's Taflinger. Oh, here he comes. Oh.
He was mad and shaking the cane. He said, I'm so mad. Those damn birds calling me cheap in the morning.
And he was kind of like that little needle, a little hot needle sticking in, in somebody's side.
He was a rascal. He was more or less what you might expect of an artist in a way. I mean, how they depict him in the movies and stuff like that. But he was just a dear, dear person, and everyone thought the world of him.
What really made her angry with him was that one of Elmer's students took some plaster and threw it out the window on her roses. She told him that she was extremely disgusted with this whole affair, and so Elmer then went out and secretly cut other roses and took them to her door and presented and said with an apology that I want to give you this bouquet of roses, Ruthie, because I'm so sorry. But they were hers. And she goes out the next morning and realizes all of her roses are gone. And he did that kind of thing. And he was, so I'd get a big kick out of Elmer. I thought he was fun. And you can imagine some people didn't like him. He walked in and Elmer's up there, and I thought we'd have a fight. And no, I went back to work and I walked by, and Elmer had his charmed. And as I walked by, I heard Elmer say, well, I remember the prostitutes in Paris sniffing cocaine back in such and such. And the kid said, oh, wow, oh, groovy, right on, man. And Elmer could tell a story for anyone. And the kid thought he was the most marvelous. He said, well, I'm in a commune in Brown County. Why don't you come down with me, man? You can hang out with us for the weekend. And Elmer said, I'll tell you, I'll do it. But I want you to get me a 16-year-old girl, just like Solomon or somebody. In the Old Testament, I want to keep my raggedy bones warm at night. And the kid said, okay, man, I'm going to, right on, I'm going to do it for you.
We used the best models in town. And we would take furs and fashions, and we used the old ruins for background and atmosphere. And at that time, there was water in the fountains. It was really beautiful. Now there's no water. It's kind of run down. But it was really great. And I would take the models out there, and we would shoot TV commercials. And we'd run into Elmer. And Elmer kind of liked the girls. And he would always go up and pat them. and I would say to them, You don't have to put up with that. And they say, he's harmless, so they didn't care, it didn't seem to bother him. But he liked the girls.
He would stay down at the studio, and he said, I got as many students and women to sleep with me as I could. I consider that my job. That's the way men are. Men are all about avoiding commitment, and women are all about setting up the nest. He was very evolutionary. His other thing was, well, women are 10 times stronger than men. That's just a fact. I said, what do you mean it's a fact? And he said, it's just a fact. Women are built for bearing children, and physically, psychologically, and every other way, women are stronger than men. Men break much easier. He could have been talking about himself.
Particularly women were the ones that either loved or hated him. Men got along with him fine, but he could seem very macho on occasion. I also have a poem that he wrote about the nature of women when I was getting married. A woman is just a hunk of hair and a rag or something. I don't know. And it was just very humorous kind of thing.
Elmer had lots of lady friends.
Yeah.
They adored him. Women adored him. He didn't just say, Indianapolis has Heron School of Art and this is the best place and blah, blah, blah. He'd say, no, it isn't. My studio's the best place.
Someone asked who were the 5 greatest painters that ever lived, and he said, well, there's Raphael, Michelangelo, Degas, and the man himself. And here's Tamayo, who is still, he had an ego.
I just wonder if there ever was, except maybe, a few who just sort of were reclusive, who weren't colossal egotists. But they had to be in order to do what they did. I think that was all part of it.
It's hard for me to say whether he was egotistical or he liked to put on a good show. Because he talked about himself like he was just really it, like he was just really hot. It's not entirely clear to me if he really thinks he was that good or he just liked to get a reaction out of people.
Besides working on art, Elmer was an avid reader and spent much of his later years talking on his ham radio and working in his darkroom.
He would have gone wild in the age of the internet because one whole room of his studio was just jam-packed with ham radio equipment. And he told me that he had communication with people in Africa and people in Australia, and that was his full-time interest.
And then he'd sit up all night with his ham radio in the corner. That was in the studio.
I think he stopped painting because he was so interested in his ham radio. He just was spending most of his time doing that.
He was in contact with people all over the country. He had pretty good equipment at the time.
He was a real ham. He could Morse code and everything. He had a license to do that, and he was very smart. Elmer was a brilliant guy.
He was also a very good photographer. He was taking pictures of us all over the place. He was an official photographer for the Indianapolis 500.
Having achieved my dream of escaping Indiana's stifling atmosphere to the freedom of California, I needed to know, after living in exciting places such as New York and Italy, how could Elmer return to quiet and sleepy Indiana? How would an artist fit in there after such a cosmopolitan existence? Maybe his artistic conservatism served him well. He did hold out hope that classic art would be revived. On a boat to Europe, he struck up a conversation with a fellow traveler.
We discussed corn cob art, whatever that is. It had to do with the Middle West being the breeding ground for men of talent, and she agreed with my prophecy that out of this middle land would come the Renaissance of America when it came. And we christened it with a fantastic title of corn cob art.
Years of city living and world traveling had made Elmer appreciate the slower pace of the Midwest, especially after his Minneapolis stay.
I'd become an inlander. I'd felt the heart of America, its generous beat, its slow rhythm that comes from the waving fields of wheat and corn, and New York was only the place where boats tied up to a pier and left for Europe. New York is the hitching post of America, in my mind.
The people that live here have kind of independent spirits, and they don't feel that they have to paint like everybody else. Now, even though Elmer's painting was realistic, it was his painting. It was uniquely his. It was his vision. Mm-hmm. And his love of history and of the human figure, and here you're not so affected by all of these influences that are coming in. You know, you're a little bit isolated because you're in the heartland, I guess, and not on either coast. And go to New York, and everybody wants it. You know, it's got to be the whatever, the New York scene or the LA scene or what have you. There's something about Indiana artists, and if you line them all up and you look at their work, it's not like a school.
I think Indiana has a lot to offer. People are very thoughtful and kindly toward artists.
I think he just felt this was home and this was where he was comfortable painting. And I mean, he could take his trips to Mexico and he could take his trips to Europe and come back here and be Elmer.
He also spent a lot of time working on his memoirs, although this is generally viewed as among his lesser accomplishments. He told one journalist that he was chronicling his artistic background to wage war against a growing flood of gutless paintings.
If I'm any good as an artist, I ought to be able to write.
He spent a lot of time on writing that book. Overall, about 20 years, off and on.
Elmer had an electric typewriter, and you sit over here under the north window, and he was typing his memoirs.
She wasn't a lovely lady. She had a drooping chin and an S-shaped protruding belly. So isn't that blogged forth in your face as she drew? But she had a hand that showed all the anatomy, hung pendant from her wrist on a protruding pelvis bone.
I felt like he did not center the book on the subject he should have centered it on, and that's the Broadway producer in New York. He centered it on his training, maybe some people like Bridgman, who was one of his teachers, which was important, I'm sure, but I'm not a book critic, but I couldn't get very much out of the book myself. I didn't read it all.
Oh, no, I didn't make it through the whole thing. It was like at the end of my senior year, he gave me this 1,000-page manuscript and said he wanted help editing it. I remember reading this thing, and I just thought it was abominable. I thought he cast himself as some huge figure in history, and he isn't. The important historical figures don't get much space at all. It was just lots of purple prose and a lot of words to get across very simple points. I thought it was just be a massive editing job.
We would sit in class. We were a captive audience, and he'd say, "Well, I wrote this chapter last night. I'm going to pass this by her." So he'd read like we couldn't make head or tails of it, and we knew it would never be published.
Could be wrong, but I don't think it would be a bestseller. Not even in the art world.
When Elmer died, he left no will and $90,000 in his bank account. As it legally had to go to the closest relatives, our grandpa and the other cousins donated almost all of it to Robert Black, who had supported Elmer for years.
Because Elmer never paid any bills. He told me he never bought any groceries, never paid any rent, and Elmer had spending money because he kept selling him portraits that he did, and Mr. Black bought them.
He made it quite clear that he sort of saw it as his sister's job to take care of him. That he was a great artiste. You know, he'd been hurt in life, he couldn't have the love that he wanted, and he pretty much saw that it was her obligation and she should be thrilled to totally support him and take care of him.
Mr. Black was not aware that there was any money at all. And of course he was shocked when there was a $90,000 account in his name.
But I can't believe he had $90,000. He was so poor mouth, it's like, I'm just a starving artist, you know, I just have bread. Then I remember he opens his refrigerator and he has like 3 things.
If you don't pay any rent and you don't pay for food, there's a chance you could accumulate something, some money. Isn't there?
What was Elmer's legacy? Was it his art or his personality? He left behind a few major works, and his students carried on the principles of learning the fundamentals of art, but as a whole, his name is not known today, even around Indianapolis.
I know of Taflinger, and the artists in town know who Taflinger is, but when you talk to people your age, or maybe a generation away, they don't know.
Elmer's lasting legacy was that he would say outrageous things that made you think.
I'm a ticket of leave man.
He called me up on the phone and he said, "Oh, this my throat. I'm having Fran's cooking a potato for me because he could digest it or whatever, get it down his throat." And he said, "Now the damn thing's about to kill me. What the hell?" And he's cursing and coughing. And he said, "I'll see you tomorrow." Okay, and boom. And that was the last I ever talked to Elmer.
Elmer died in 1980 at age 90 and was described as the grand old man of Indiana art in his obituaries.
I think he was well known, period. But when he died, it was on the front page of the Indianapolis Star in headlines.
What do you attribute your longevity, Elmer? He said, chocolate chip cookies. You got any more over there?
Because it's about time the world knew about Elmer Taflinger.
How my children are ruined like Elmer's ruins.
Our homage to our eccentric family.